All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit of Econ 101 today. I'm going to talk about the law of supply and demand. And by the end of this video, what I'm ultimately going to do is show you how the law of supply and demand is not actually a law at all. What the law of supply and demand is an observation of economic defense mechanisms that are so consistent, that has been so consistent, this observation has been so consistent that we have come to believe the law of supply and demand is akin to the law of gravity, for example. So if you jump off a building, you're going to fall to the ground 1 billion times out of a billion if you don't have enough lift to overcome the force of gravity, right? If you're not in a plane or a parachute or whatever, for example. So to kind of go back, to get there, let's look at the law of supply and demand. And to do that, I'm going to give you 4 different scenarios, okay? And in truth, these scenarios, there's actually only 2 scenarios, but let's just talk about it in terms of we'll talk about it from the supply side and from the demand side. So let's assume that supply increases and demand stays the same. What's going to happen to the prices in this scenario? Well, the prices are going to drop, okay? Because what happens is you have a surplus of goods, and there's not enough consumer demand to purchase those goods. So, to simplify this, let's talk about cars. Let's imagine that the car dealership has a surplus of cars and they're not selling. Well, if that car dealership, or if the owners or the price setters want to profit from those cars and they don't want to let the cars sit there and rot on the lot, then they're going to have to lower the prices to make the cars more enticing to consumers in order to increase demand, right? So if cars aren't selling for 50 grand, you lower them to 40 grand and all of a sudden demand increases, right? So in this scenario, again, if supply increases and demand stays the same, prices will drop due to the surplus in order for the price setters to maximize profits. Now, let's imagine the opposite scenario. Let's imagine that supply decreases and demand stays the same. Well, now you don't have a surplus of cars, now you have a scarcity of cars. And what this means is that consumers are fighting over the cars. And what that competition over between consumers enables is it allows the price setter or the owner of the cars to increase the price because the consumers are willing to pay more. And ultimately, whatever consumer has the most money is going to end up walking away with the car, right? So again, if supply decreases and demand stays the same, then the price of the car is going to increase, okay? Now, let's now manipulate the demand. So we're going to leave the supply the same, but we're going to imagine that demand drops, okay? So demand drops and supply stays the same. What's going to happen to the prices? Well, again, we're kind of mimicking the first scenario I described. What essentially happens again in this scenario is that there's now a surplus of cars. So the cars are once again sitting on the lot, and in order for the owner to maximize profits, they're going to decrease the price in order to increase demand in the car. And if we imagine the opposite scenario with demand, where demand increases and supply stays the same, now you have a similar example to the second scenario I described. Now there is a scarcity of cars relative to demand. And what that enables the owner or the price setter to do is to increase the price of the car. So ultimately, what we have to realize here, though, is that it isn't the law of supply and demand that is fueling these price changes. What is fueling the price changes is the underlying desire for profit, okay? And who owns that profit? Well, the owners own the profit. The price setters own the profit. So we have to really think about why it is that the owner desires profit. Well, they desire profit because profit is associated with well-being, right? If you don't have any money, you're probably going to starve, or you're gonna be living in a tent or something, right? We fear the woes of poverty. We fear not having money in our bank account. So therefore, we become owners, we become price setters in order to acquire profit to insulate ourselves from the poverty. So, again, this is why I said that the law of supply and demand isn't actually a law, but is in fact an observation of common economic defense mechanisms. We are defending ourselves from poverty, and to do that, we perhaps take advantage of consumers by maximizing profits at their expense. Now, this isn't a necessity, right? We don't necessarily have to take advantage of consumers. It is possible to follow the law of supply and demand and to not take advantage of consumers. And one way that might happen is, for example, to structure an economy where everybody owns equal equity in every company in the economy. And what this would mean is that the profit gets distributed evenly amongst everybody, right? Therefore, one person's profit doesn't come at another person's expense. One owner's profit doesn't come at the consumer's expense. In reality, what would happen is it would just kind of fuel innovation. But I'm not actually advocating here for a perfect communistic economy. What I am advocating for is an economy that understands this underlying desire for profit motive. I'm advocating for an economy that understands why an individual desires profit. Again, it's that underlying fear. We desire profit to insulate ourselves from a fear of poverty. And where this leads us to, potentially, is high competition and high wealth inequality. But if wealth inequality gets too high, then eventually consumers aren't going to have money to purchase the very goods and services that they are producing as employees. So if we allow wealth inequality to get to that point, the economy eats itself alive and it collapses, right? On the other hand, if you respect other people's fears, other people's fear of poverty, then what you do is you create a foundation of access to physiological necessities. And what that essentially means is that we agree that the law of supply and demand should not apply to markets that produce necessities. Or alternatively, we create a government that provides those physiological necessities to everybody. And what this does is creates kind of a cushion. It's like a social safety net, right? You can create the government, or you can create unions or worker cooperatives, but one way or another, you have to provide those physiological necessities to everybody, lest revolution ensue, right? If people don't have the things they need to survive, they're gonna get them one way or another. They're gonna get desperate, and that might mean violence. That might mean a socialistic revolution. It might mean a national strike or an international strike. The point is to recognize your fellow human's fear. And that goes for both the billionaire and the poor person, right? You have to realize that the billionaire is only trying to defend themselves from their fear of poverty. And the billionaire has to do the same. And if there is a disconnect there, and the billionaire and the poor person are not respecting each other's fears, then ultimately you're going to have a revolution of some sort. A revolution could be an evolution of the economic structure, or it could be a violent revolution. In order to avoid the violent revolution, I think we want to lean into the economic evolution, and what that essentially means is perhaps a socialistic structure, or not a communistic structure, but a socialistic structure, or a commune that provides physiological necessities, or strong unions, strong worker cooperatives, consumer boycotts, things like this, right? So again, the law of supply and demand is not a law. The law of supply and demand can work if people respect each other's fear of poverty. But if you only look out for your own fear of poverty and disregard everybody else's, then your neighbor's going to be coming for your food in short order. So give that a little thought. Thanks for watching.